going to talk about the Foundation Center, but in the context of really looking at some trends that are shaping the future of philanthropy. And illustrating those trends, a lot of the way I'll be illustrating it is actually through things that the Foundation Center has developed. The first trend I want to talk about is that organized philanthropy, and by that I mean foundations, not individual giving, but foundations, will continue to grow in the United States in terms of assets and giving. If you look at the foundation growth through the years, you can see this chart just starts in 2003, which shows the total giving of American foundations. It's grown from about $30 billion a year to about $55 billion a year in 2013. And if you look further at that data, those numbers reflect what we call independent, endowed foundations, operating foundations that don't make grants but actually operate their own programs, corporate foundations sponsored by, obviously, corporations, and community foundations. The total number of foundations of those four types is about 86,000. They have total assets of $715 billion, and we actually project that by 2014, those assets will have climbed to about $790 billion. And that's because of the appreciation of the stock market, but also the demographic replacement rate, if you will, of foundations is positive. Every year in the United States, more new foundations are created than go out of business or spend down their assets. And again, total giving, $52 billion. We estimate in 2014 that will grow to about $57 billion. So this is a growth industry. And if you look at U.S. formation, foundation formation by state, it's kind of interesting. This map shows the United States in 1975. The dark blue gives you greater density of number of foundations. The dark gray, slightly less, and the light gray, even less, and the white, virtually none. So in 1975, this was prominently a bi-coastal industry, dominated by New York in the lead, and then followed by Texas and California. If you fast forward to 2011, you can see that foundations growth in California equaled that of New York, and you begin to see this map fill out with the transformation of the American economies, especially the rise of the Southwest and the Southeast of the United States. So you actually find a spread of foundations much more over the national territory than you did 30 or 40 years ago. The second trend I want to talk about is that U.S. philanthropy will become an increasingly segmented industry with a relatively small but growing number of richly endowed, well-staffed, and sophisticated foundations, a growing number with global ambitions, and a very large number of much smaller foundations, some with little or no staff at all, whose giving is primarily local. And obviously the big head there is Bill Gates, who needs no introduction. And one of the reasons this is happening, this growth in philanthropy, is through things like the Giving Pledge. You all know about this. A pledge started by Bill and Melinda Gates and their best friend, Warren Buffett, basically challenging the top billionaires in the Forbes list to make a public pledge to dedicate up to half of their wealth to philanthropy. Now this is just a public pledge they make, and their letter goes up on a nice pastel-colored website that is put out by the Giving Pledge people. But the Foundation Center, in its role as being a neutral information provider and kind of a tracking system for philanthropy, actually decided to launch an independent site called Eye on the Giving Pledge. It's actually within a transparency site we have called glasspockets.org, dedicated to transparency and philanthropy. And this actually looks at each one of the 122 billionaires that have signed the Giving Pledge, and from publicly available sources and our own data, publishes where their fortunes came from, what industries, where they're from, what foundations they're part of or they've created, what nonprofit boards they're on, tax returns of those institutions, and news stories about their giving. Just to give the public a way to track, to see how these billionaires are actually fulfilling a pledge that they made to dedicate half of their wealth. And if you look at some of these more closely, what's interesting is we did some analysis with about 122 of them. You begin to have a data set. So we looked at things like the average age. And what's changing is that some of these that are signing the Giving Pledge are very young. You've got featured here Dustin Moskovitz and Carrie Tuna. Dustin Moskovitz was one of the founders of Facebook. He's a young guy. He's not quite 30, I think. And he has $5.2 billion. And he and his wife are setting up a philanthropy and doing it in quite a different way than an earlier generation of philanthropists would do. Also, if you look at the pie chart, we analyzed where their wealth came from. If you had drawn this pie chart 30 years ago, most of the money would have come from mining and manufacturing. But what we're seeing is that that's being eclipsed now with this new wealth coming into philanthropy. And much more of the wealth that's coming into philanthropy was derived from banking and investment and from technology services and software. Kind of makes sense when you think about what's going on in the world. And of course, there's an Australian in the Giving Pledge family, Andrew Forrest, with $4.8 billion, a little poorer than Dustin Moskovitz, but nonetheless a considerable fortune, who has decided to join the Giving Pledge. There's now, I think, 15 or 16 non-US donors that have begun to join this pledge. But despite this growth in philanthropy, it remains very difficult to actually get information on philanthropy. Now, I know in some ways the US is sort of seen as not only the sort of epicenter in terms of the volume of resources and number of foundations, but also is seen that way in terms of transparency. But the work of the Foundation Center shows that it's not easy to gather information about foundations, even in a country which has mandatory government reporting of basic data. And we did a survey a number of years ago, so 2011, to try to find out how many foundations had websites. And only 29% of those that responded said that they had websites. And 76% of the foundations had 4 staff or less. So that shows you the segmentation. At one end, you've got the Gates Foundation with close to $40 billion in assets, giving away $4 billion a year, with 1,300 staff and growing every month. But then you've got tens of thousands of foundations that have no staff or fewer than 4 staff. Now, this statistic on websites, that's a pretty appalling figure, but we wanted to get the exact figure. So we actually looked through our entire database, over 90,000 foundations, to discern whether or not they had a URL attached to them, or a Facebook page, or whatever. And we actually found that only 7% of foundations have websites. It gets a little better if you look at the ones with 100 million in assets or more. About 70% of them, those are the bigger foundations, they have websites. The next trend I want to talk about is philanthropy. It's not just a US industry, it's a global industry. And our databases, as John said, are increasingly including not only US foundations, but non-US foundations. This is a mapping platform that we've actually just launched. It's in beta. It's called Foundation Maps. And it basically tracks grant giving by US foundations and by other foundations around the world. And you can dive into this, click, drill down on the information. You can go to Australia, for example, and the data is in here. It's not the complete philanthropic giving in Australia, obviously, but it's what we have in our databases in terms of grants being made in Australia. So you can see about $342 million in grants, over 2,000 grants made to over 1,000 organizations by 100 funders. So if you want to drill down further, we can go to Melbourne, for example. You can keep drilling down on this map, and as you drill down, these bubbles disperse and actually begin to show up on street corners, just like you find a Starbucks on your telephone. And here we are on a street corner, and we're seeing an organization that has a little, some grants, about $2 million worth of grants, which turns out to be the International Detention Coalition, with a number of international funders, one of which is the foundation which I was president for a number of years, the Oak Foundation, in Geneva, Switzerland. And a very interesting grant actually prevent and limit the use of detention as a tool of migration management, affecting refugees, asylum seekers, and other migrants. So this gives you sort of an idea of how this information can be displayed in a way that it can be searched and accessed to help people both find grants and for foundations to look for opportunities and find partners. And the reason foundations and philanthropy is becoming more of a global industry is in some ways an unfortunate result of one of the aspects of the world economy. The world economy, no matter what you think of it, is monstrously efficient at doing one thing, and that's manufacturing billionaires. And there's every country which has a growing economy has a growing billionaire class. And partly because of things like the Giving Pledge, a larger percentage of those billionaires are beginning to turn to philanthropy. So depending on what year you're looking at the Forbes list, the richest guy in the world is either Bill Gates or Carlos Slim, who's Mexican. And the second largest category by nationality of billionaires on the Forbes list are Chinese. So the world's becoming a very different place than it was just a few decades ago. And how many people have ever heard of Zenstrom philanthropies? No. Nobody. This is the usual reaction. Well, have you ever heard of Scaife? Well, the Zenstroms were the couple that started Scaife. When they started Scaife, they were so poor that the bank wouldn't even give them a loan to buy a house. They created Scaife, as good entrepreneurs would do, by anticipating a need that nobody knew they had. They sold the business, I believe, first to eBay, and then eBay sold it to Microsoft, but billions of dollars later, they decided to start a foundation, a philanthropy. And what's interesting about their philanthropy is two of the issues that they chose to focus on were international human rights and global climate change. And when you stop to think about it, whereas an earlier generation of philanthropists whose wealth was derived from a physical community, when they went to create a foundation, their primary instinct was to give back to their community. But what does community mean for the people that created Scaife? Community for them is not local and physical, it's virtual and global. So this is another thing we're beginning to see in the new philanthropists. And further proof that it's not just an American or perhaps an English or even an Australian invention, philanthropy. What about philanthropy in China? This is actually a map that's on a website of a partner of ours, which is called the China Foundation Center. It's actually an independent organization, but it uses our name, puts China in the front. This is a map showing actually the locations of what under Chinese law are classified as foundations, and that's a whole other lecture in its own right. But basically showing basic information about their assets, their programmatic focuses, the name, their address, etc. And they have now managed to pull together data for close to 3,000 or so foundations in China. What about African philanthropy in Africa? This is a map that actually shows grants made by 5 African foundations. These are not European foundations or American foundations in Africa. These are actually African foundations in Africa, making about 1,200 grants to 900 different organizations. And if you drill down in this map, and you can drill down and actually see what each grant is for, the first thing you begin to see is that the choices those grant makers are making in Africa are very different than the choices that American philanthropists or European philanthropists are making when they fund in Africa. They're funding different kinds of organizations, often smaller, more grassroots organizations than the big internationally focused foundations would do. And further proof that this is a global industry is that every industry has its own infrastructure, and philanthropy is no different. There's an organization called WINGS, which stands for Worldwide Initiative for Grantmaker Support. It's a global organization based in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And they are an actual federation of associations, of foundations, and other kinds of organizations throughout the world that somehow support philanthropy. These are not foundations. These are people that actually provide support services like we do to the industry of philanthropy. And you can see that their network encompasses 147 organizations in 53 countries. And these organizations alone have budgets of about $29 or $30 million. Okay? These are not foundations, these are organizations that somehow support and professionalize and produce information about philanthropy. Another trend is that as philanthropy and the fortunes that fuel it grow, governments, the media, and online communities will demand to know more about philanthropy and philanthropists. This is basically about transparency. And this man doesn't strike any fear in your hearts, but he strikes fear in the hearts of American foundations. Okay, he's Antonio Bezerra. He's a Democratic congressman from Los Angeles, and he's the head of the House Ways and Means Committee, which is the committee in the House of Representatives which oversees foundations. But this is the man that really scares American foundations, is Senator Charles Grassley. He's a Republican, the ranking Republican in the Senate Finance Committee, and he's from Iowa. And on a slow day when there's not much going on in Iowa or in Washington, the soft underbelly of those big, rich, endowed foundations on the East and West Coast are a really great target. So he goes after them, and often they give very good reasons to do it. He has actually issued some very good constructive legislation to curb things like self-dealing and other kinds of abuses that should not happen among charitable institutions. But also as these new sort of tech philanthropists come in and other very high net worth individuals, we're beginning to see interest in philanthropy from places that never came from before. This is actually from the financial press, from CNBC, an online and television network. And this is kind of interesting. The star of nerd philanthropy dominates the top 50 givers. So they're looking at the techno nerds as becoming a new philanthropist. And you can also sort of, by the ads, the featured things on the right-hand corner, you can see who their audience is. They're not targeting grassroots NGOs. They're bottle of Palace's wine sold for $9,400. So this is actually a new focus of attention on philanthropy. And this is a really interesting example of transparency. When President Obama in the United States started the Affordable Care Health Act, the sort of national health insurance for uninsured Americans, there was obviously a lot of controversy about it, but a series of group of nonprofit organizations sort of rose up to enroll poor Americans in these new health plans. And one of them, which was actually called Enroll America, the head of it had very close ties to the head of the Obama cabinet member for Health and Human Services, Catherine Sebelius at the time. So reporters began to see, well, where's the money coming from for this nonprofit? And they discovered, actually, that some of that money was coming from foundations, as a good reporter would do. And it's interesting because the way they found that was actually through information provided by the Foundation Center from a group of foundations that have decided to make their available data, their grant data available in real time as machine-readable open data, and they're doing it through us as something called the reporting commitment. And one of those foundations was the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that made a $10 million grant to Enroll America in support of the new healthcare plans. What's really interesting about this is that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation volunteered to be part of this reporting commitment to report their data in open machine-readable format. But when the New York Times reporter called them to inquire about the grant, the communications department of the foundation responded, yes, we can confirm that we made a grant. However, it's our policy not to comment on the amount of those grants. And here, this is actually their own information that's appeared on the website. It's very clear. It says, Enroll America, $10 million, 12 months, and this appeared a week after the grant was made. So it gives you an idea sort of how this new era of transparency, even these large staff foundations, are sort of caught even within them, with some parts of the organizations wanting to be more transparent and others still sort of have the old playbook. Another trend is that the toolkit of organized philanthropy will increasingly be a continuum, ranging from grants at one end to market rate mission-related investments, some people call it impact investing, at the other, with a broad array of operating programs and charitable activities in between. The days are over when nonprofits sort of did all the good and foundations were their ATM machines. There's a lot of other kinds of instruments out there and organizations that are somehow competing to do social good. You hear a lot about mission investing or impact investing. One of the difficulties we have as a Foundation Center is that there's not a good data trail for this because the reporting requirements and regulation of this have really not caught up with the evolution of these new forms of investment. We did a little bit of survey research on this, and we report on foundations with about $120 billion in assets. They're doing some type of mission investing. But if you look at actually the foundations and public charities that could potentially be involved in this, they have assets of 1.4 trillion. So it gives you an idea of the size of the market if mission investing ever really took off. And these are just some examples around the world of things that we found in terms of mission investments. The Midyar Network investing $10 million for a startup in Mexico, the Kellogg Foundation, etc. Another trend is related to this, and this is new forms of social investment will continue to evolve, such that foundations will share the landscape with online giving and volunteering platforms, for-profit social enterprises, and new forms we have yet to see. So the most obvious manifestation of this is online giving. There's lots of online giving platforms. I saw one study the other day that managed to discover over 200 of them. Obviously, this is an early market phenomenon. There'll be a shakeout, and at the end, only the viable ones will remain. But this really has ushered in a whole new era of citizen philanthropy. You, as a private citizen, become a philanthropist by searching for a cause online, connecting, and making your donation on one of these platforms. But it raises a lot of really interesting issues. This is a fascinating case that happened a number of years ago. This is Chris Hughes. Chris Hughes was another one of the founders of Facebook. And he was actually the architect of the online social media campaign during the first Obama election. So this kid basically got Obama elected, and he was one of the founders of Facebook. So he shows up on the doorstep of a number of foundations, and he wants to start a new kind of social engagement network called Jumo. Jumo is a Yoruba word meaning something positive, I can't remember what. And the idea was that if you gave people an online platform with all the facility and technology of Facebook behind it to engage with causes around the world that motivated them, eventually they would become donors. They looked at some research that said that engagement comes before giving. So he was going to create this. It was all going to be connected to Facebook, so that if you were following an organization in Nigeria that was working on domestic violence, the fact that you were following would populate your Facebook page, your Facebook network, that would just kind of multiply. So this guy, he walks into some foundations, and imagine yourself, how many of you work for foundations? Okay. So this guy, he comes in, he's 28 years old, you try to do your usual foundation thing. You say, well, young man, what do you have to say for yourself? What's your track record? Well, founded Facebook, and I got a president elected. Okay, you could probably decide that this guy was a good bet. So he quickly raised $3 million from foundations. So this is the story. He creates it in 2010 as a nonprofit organization operating a social network connecting individuals and organizations working for global change. Okay. He raised $3.5 million in grants for charitable purposes, tax-exempt money, right, during 2010 2011 to get this thing going. 2011, Fast Company magazine reports that Jumo has been acquired, it's been sold by a for-profit social enterprise whose name is Good. Now, I wrote a blog about this, which I described it as shape-shifting. What's fascinating about this is here's a nonprofit social organization that it didn't really work. So it was sold to a for-profit social enterprise. And because this had to be sorted out by the Attorney General of the state of New York, the terms of the deal were sealed. So we really don't know the terms of that deal. And tax-exempt foundation money had been used essentially to flip an organization to a for-profit social enterprise. And the Attorney General was sort of left to figure out whether or not the charitable purpose of the resources was an intellectual property and other things was respected or not. So we're beginning to see more and more examples of this. There's two other trends I wanted to talk about together. One is that philanthropy will be increasingly data and knowledge driven as donors strive for more impact on a larger scale, and finding the right information quickly will be paramount. And then the other is that working at scale will require collaboration with other foundations, government, the private sector, nonprofits, often across the globe. So these are some examples of how this information can power collaborative efforts between donors and other sectors. This is one that the Foundation Center developed actually for the Open Society Foundation, George Soros' organization, on strengthening black male achievement. This is addressing specifically the problems faced by black men and boys in American society, which a lot of you, I'm sure you know, I mean, the incarceration rates, the social indicators among black men and boys in America are absolutely atrocious for a developed country. And foundations do something about it, but this was a way to show how much foundations do about what's working, what's not, sharing information, allowing nonprofits to identify foundations, foundations to identify partners, and learn from what is working. This is something else we did for a group called Media Impact Funders. This is a group of foundations that fund media, and they wanted some kind of interactive application that would show both nonprofits and foundations what's going on in media. And the first thing we had to do was sit down with them and figure out, well, what in the heck is media anymore? We used to know what it was, the television publishing, but we had to work out this this is Jeff's department, data architecture. This is what data architecture means. Sitting down and defining all the categories that are media. So you can sort of see them. And it's really kind of interesting, things like constituency journalism, citizen journalism, media literacy, media justice, all sorts of terms that wouldn't be considered support for media a number of years ago. Also, for them, we collected research that had been done by nonprofits and funded by foundations on media in terms of best practice, what we've learned, what works and what doesn't in funding media. Another example of this is with WASH. WASH stands for Water Access, Sanitation, and Hygiene. A number of very important foundations around the world fund this. 900 million people in the world do not have access to safe water. It's one of the largest problems facing the world community. But these funders wanted, again, a place where they could see each other's information. But also, more importantly for them, they knew that the really big money for this was coming from the big national aid donors, the Foreign Aid Program of Australia, of Sweden, of England, of the United States, of other countries. And that required that we go into the databases of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, OECD. And this mapping application is showing you actually the little purple in the center is foundation giving, and the larger green circles is international development aid giving. And you can actually search this by strategies and all sorts of other things, and allows you to see that mix and where the private money is leveraging the public money. And to produce all these kinds of things requires lots and lots of data. That's what the Foundation Center does. We're essentially a data-driven organization, and this just sort of gives you an idea of all the different kinds of data that makes it possible to produce these tools and platforms. And then another trend is that technology will make it possible to do things tomorrow with data, its delivery, and its visualization that we can't begin to imagine today. Now, we're getting into the realm of big data now. Some of you probably know this story. It's a few years old now, but it's really interesting. Target started figuring out from analyzing its gazillion of search records that there was a pattern of young women that were most likely pregnant based upon what they were searching for at Target stores. And they did a targeted marketing campaign to those households. And they got this irate letter from a father who said, how dare you insinuate that my teenage daughter is pregnant? It turns out that Target was right and the father was wrong. And he ended up writing an apology letter to Target saying, well, unfortunately there were things going on in our household that we did not know about. But Target knew about it through analyzing millions and millions of logistics. So that's kind of a creepy example of big data. This one is a little more frivolous example. Anybody know what this is? It's a chart that tracks a trend, obviously. And it kind of peaks before spring break and then goes down, and it peaks, goes way up right before Christmas. And anybody have any guesses what that might be? You've seen this one, exactly. Okay, you win the prize. This was basically looking at millions and millions and millions of Facebook relationship status and then charting them over time. And if you think about it, it's trying to make sense. Before Christmas, I mean, why buy the present, right, if you're going to break up? But big data, actually, it came on the scene in a really big way. It was on the scene long before this. McKinsey did a study in 2011 that tried to show the potential contribution, in this case to the American economy, if big data for different sectors of the economy could actually be harnessed. What's fascinating about this is it shows sectors like manufacturing, wholesale trade, transportation, information, government, but philanthropy wasn't even there. An almost $800 billion industry in the United States was not even on McKinsey's radar. And if you think about it, foundations are ingesting, we think of foundations more as providers of resources and meaning money. Okay? And if you ever work for a foundation, you know what it's like actually to be seen as someone that can provide money, because you're surrounded by lots and lots and lots of people that want access to those funds. But there's a lot of other assets that foundations have potentially. Foundations get grant applications, usually in some form, those that get grants. If they make grants, they get reports. Those of you who are nonprofits and those nonprofits here know what it's like to fill out reports for foundations. And if you have lots of donors, you have lots of different kinds of reports, and it's a different format and asks for different things. And increasingly, foundations have their own publications, not only annual reports, but some of them fund research, and they publish research of their own, they have evaluations, there's a lot of internal information, and that information is increasingly digital information. It's in ones and zeros, which means it has the potential to become a philanthropic version of big data. And historically, the consumers of that information have been the foundation itself. I mean, most foundations collect information for the purpose of doing due diligence and for processing and making and tracking grants. But in today's world, people, whether you know it or not, are often consuming that information. A lot of people are scraping information from websites all the time. They're finding other ways to get it. And they're using that information. So the potential actually for philanthropy to evolve is accelerating. Philanthropy used to be about giving away money. And I think all of us now sort of have moved to the idea of philanthropy being social investment. It's not just about giving away money. Somehow we're investing in society and we're expecting some kind of return. The Foundation Center, we really believe that the sort of the next wave is going to be to add on to giving away money and to social investment, the notion of managing information and producing knowledge. Now, a number of years ago, I was talking to the board of the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, a very important foundation in the United States, and I was showing a lot of data things and mapping applications and all that, and one of their board members said, well, do you think that at the end of the day, that if we have all this information and data, we'll actually be making better decisions? And I think there are some things that won't change about philanthropy and probably shouldn't change, and that there will always be this balance between intellect and intuition. A lot about philanthropy and good philanthropists is really intuition. And at the end of the day, when you decide to make a grant, there's a leap of faith involved. No matter how much due diligence you've done, how much information, you're making a statement that I believe in this individual, I believe in this organization, and my organization is going to be in solidarity with your organization to make something happen in the world. And I want to end with one of my favorite quotes from philanthropy. I think foundations are entering into the most difficult of all fields. They're going right straight ahead, knowing that their fingers will be burned again, because in these fields, you cannot be sure of your results, and you cannot be sure that you will avoid risk. Now, that was not said by Bill Gates, and it was not said in the last few years. It was actually said by this gentleman. His name is Russell Leffingwell, who was a Republican banker who was testifying before the McCarthy era hearing in 1952, when the foundation of which he was the board chair, the Carnegie Foundation, was being accused of supporting un-American activities. And he had the courage to tell his congressional inquisitors, no, we can't guarantee the results of what we're funding because what we're funding is too difficult and too challenging as it should be. And for me, this is really what philanthropy is about and what it should be about. And I think it's really quite inspiring that someone so long ago said this about our field. And in some ways, you don't hear a lot of philanthropic leaders today saying things like this, but I think more of us should. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, John. We could certainly use some of this rain back home, I can tell you. The cows have been getting into the neighbours' paddocks, and it's not fun moving those through back. Dean, Michael, our friends at Swinburne, my colleagues here, and most particularly our colleagues from overseas, have really been treated to something very special tonight, and I'm very privileged to have this opportunity to be at Swinburne, but also to be here to express appreciation for what we've heard tonight. I think it's rare to have PowerPoints put up, but any one of them you want to stop and visit for longer. There is a story behind so many of those. And such substance, and I do hope that we have the opportunity as an audience to perhaps have a look at those and be able to imbibe some of that a little bit more. You started out speaking with or John introduced the history of McCarthyism as one that spurred the genesis of the Foundation Centre. And we've been lucky in Australia, we didn't have McCarthyism to start out our study of philanthropy. We're a similar age to QUT and our friends here at Swinburne. And I guess that maybe if I can use one of the phrases that you used, Brad, maybe it was anticipating a need that no one knew they had for more information about this whole philanthropy area. And it's so exciting, I think. I know that many of the people in the room here will be part of creating knowledge about philanthropy. We'll be either studying it, we'll be working in the area, and we'll have, by your presence here tonight, an interest in how that knowledge can be better shaped for our sector here within Australia so that we can create those better outcomes and those inspiring outcomes that we've seen some examples of tonight. Foundation Centre, we have a little bit of involvement with, in that at QUT we are incorporating one of those many libraries across the world, a cooperated collection. And I have to say that I'm very proud. About every 6 weeks we have grassroots organisations come in, and we have a volunteer consultant talking to these grassroots organisations, someone who assists them to understand grant making, and they have a look at this site and they're amazed at small organisations within Australia who are actually benefiting from the foundations in America and beyond, and to be able to tap in with such ease, with that fingertip ability to be able to say, yes, an organisation on the Gold Coast, an arts organisation, did get $15,000. It can be done, that permission to succeed. So our Foundation Centre Library is one that we treasure, and I know the organisations that use it too. I have to say that our books are kept in a balmier environment in our Foundation Centre Library than Melbourne tonight, but it's such a pleasure to have that ability to give that to local organisations. So much of what you said resonated tonight, Brad. The fact that we are in a growth industry, I'm always interested to see this role of a grant maker in particular growing. I think if you wanted to advise your children what industry to get into, there's a few up there that we saw tonight in terms of growth areas, but I also think the role of the grant maker is going to, if we are going to see growth here in foundations, we are going to need more and more of these amazing skills, and they are amazing skills. This managing knowledge, this note you ended on, I think is so inherent to what grant makers are able to do and are able to deliver. I was interested in the maps that you put up, and I was reflecting on Australia, as I suppose many of us would have been. Would there have been more foundations in Victoria? Indeed, there would have been, because of wonderful regulation, of course, course, that was spurred by a philanthropist in the 1800s down here that ensured that Victoria has been a home of philanthropy. I'm very excited as a non-Victorian, appreciative of all that Victoria does, but as a non-Victorian, certainly excited to see that in Australia that map would be dotted far more these days with foundations in other states. And how exciting is that? Because we do need to have this global perspective. We do need to have this wider perspective. I came down by plane this afternoon and I didn't know the plane going bumped when we got to the state border. I didn't see that happen, so I think we do have to have that wider vision. And we do recognise as well that regulation like that can be a lever to the growth of philanthropy. And it was exciting to see some of the normalising of philanthropy that you were reflecting there with the Giving Pledge. And I think we are starting to see this here as well within Australia, that across all of these income levels, you reflected on democratisation of philanthropy, the fact that with online giving platforms, all of us can do so much more so easily with our giving, and so many people are taking that opportunity. So I think that that whole idea of giving growing because it is becoming more the norm is something that we are gradually, at last, starting to see within Australia in a more concerted way. You mentioned media. Our media, from our studies, is certainly starting to talk more about philanthropy. That horrific figure of the websites, is that etched into our minds, the 7%? I was shuddering and thinking we should probably do the exercise here, and I don't think it would be 7%. Would I be right? And all sorts of reasons behind that. The interesting things, of course, for research are what that figure tells us, and then unpacking the reasons why and the implications of that. In terms of transparency, this brave new world of transparency, and that attractive-looking senator from Iowa that you shared with us tonight, gosh, when you have nightmares of you had that picture up in front of you too often. I really am so delighted that you are here to open the conversation. When I say open the conversation, it's obviously a conversation that has been had here as well, but to have someone come and speak about glass pockets, about the initiatives that you have been able to achieve, not in your own country alone, but in other parts of the world, those blogs that you have on your site, that we can have a look at those examples of organisations that are successfully being more transparent, I think are terribly important for us. I think tonight's gathering is really one of those strategic conversations that we need in our sector to grow our sector. And so I was delighted to see those kinds of resources being put up there. We would know, all of us from our own networks, that this is not an easy conversation. There are stakeholders within our own organisations, within our own communities, who would not understand some of the information that would come out from our organisations, the rationale. And it's very hard to be open when there is that chance to be misunderstood. It is a luxury to be understood. But it is a conversation that needs to be had. And I'm sure there is a continuum of openness that we can probably achieve over time. But we should always be asking as well, what's the right rationale for openness? You know, we don't just accept it because it's a buzzword, because it's a trend. So we need to really look at this conversation, I think, in a lot more depth. I would note that Philanthropy Australia is embarking on its benchmarking project, and I know that the Foundation Centre has done some wonderful work in benchmarking that I'm sure Philanthropy Australia will have a good look at as well. So I think there are some tools internally and there are some messages externally that are possible from that. You talked about the blurred sector lines that we are seeing, social enterprise, philanthropy, government, corporate, all of these different actors that we are seeing, and all of these different approaches that are in use. And again, I think it is part of the complexity and the richness of the role of the grant maker that we need to be so alert and so expert in these other areas. This is why I do love education, and forgive me if I'm spruiking something that I work in. I have no intention to be self-interested. It is a genuine belief that we all of us do what we do better if we think wider. if we go outside of our tram lines. And so I'm a great believer in courses such as Swinburne. One of my staff members is a Swinburne graduate, and boy, you're breathing wood down here. There's just so much that can be learned, I think, beyond our single area, and we need that broader knowledge to be able to do what we do well. Collaboration, the funder collectives that we see here, we're going to see so much more of that, and what a wonderful thing. What a fantastic expression of the values of our sector, that we actually can do more of that, and how information can really make that possible, and technology. I guess that I would just like to end on the note of how privileged I think we've been tonight to have an introduction to this kind of information. How lucky we are that you are one of the people who does have a website, and what a website. I think that we all have some new directions to think about in our own organisations, in our own work, and in our own searching on the net as a result of what you've covered here tonight. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to say when I got here, but thank you for giving me plenty of information to be able to reflect back to our audience. And thank you to our friends at Swinburne. My friend John Fitzgerald uses the word ecology, that philanthropy is an ecology. And I think that that's a perfect word. I think education is part of that ecology. I think our international friends are part of that ecology. I think the people in our organisations, be they philanthropy or non-profit, it's all part of that ecology. And I think there's so much more that we can do to make that ecology work better. And I think tonight has been a great effort to achieve that. So thank you, Brad.
This has been a Swinburne production.